So the first novel I wrote it in a closet. And that first closet was literally 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. He was basically gave me a warning that, like, your creativity and your prolificness, the enemy of that, the thing that will steal it, as you get older, is not your age. Your mind is not any different. Your mind, if anything, just gets sharper and sharper and better. But it's distractions.
It's distractions.
And it's distractions which manifested in 1,000 emails a day.
Yep.
It manifested in people calling you. It's manifested in someone becoming sort of popular or well-known.
Yeah.
So suddenly everyone wants you to speak or do this or do that. We started the Grotto, and we dreamed of a day that it could be a bigger thing. And we're now going into our 23rd year. We have 125 writers at 2nd and Bryant.
Yep.
And 3 classes a night, and the writers can make money teaching, which is great for them.
Boom, what's up everyone? Welcome to Simulation. We are sitting down with Bronson.
What's up, man? How are you?
Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks, man.
I appreciate you so much because you are an extremely distinguished author, plus you have inspired so many other authors, plus you are very polymathic in the way that you think about the world and civilization. And I want to talk about you and how you got to where you're at, but I also really want to talk about your visions for where we're going and how we can inspire the next generation.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to unpack.
Right.
Yeah. Even after demo day, which was just a couple days ago for Indie Bio, which Poe has gotten much more close with Indie Bio, and there was this moment when I was like, oh, you know, Poe is like just a multidisciplinary writer, and that when we were talking in the group, you, myself, and Kayla were talking to the very end of the night. The way that you were articulating your thoughts about people and automation and meaning and morals and ethics, I would love to talk about that at some point in the conversation, maybe a little bit towards the end. Poe, who the hell are you? You know, how did you even discover that writing was something that you cared about? And you've lived here like 30 years, you said, in San Francisco?
Yeah, I moved here in '86, so quickly, that's 32 years.
From LA?
No, I grew up in Seattle.
In Seattle, that's right.
Yeah, I grew up in Seattle. I came down to go to Stanford, then I moved here. Yeah, I grew up, when I was growing up, I was a math guy. But I didn't really like hanging out with the math people that much. And like it was all right being on the math team, going to the state math championships and the wrestling team band and that kind of thing. But I was also a soccer player, and sort of family life was a bit unstable. And
why was it unstable?
We were like the first family on the block, or the first family we were the second I'd ever heard of in Seattle, grew up in Seattle, where parents got divorced. And it happened to a friend of my mom's first. As a child, like growing up, like you were like the first of a wave, right? A wave that would last 30, 40 years.
A wave of?
Families getting split up,
dual
households, having trouble paying the bills.
Let's see, Poe is illustrating what would look like on a graph over time as the divorce rate probably starting at around 25% or something fairly low.
Really low.
Yeah.
No, lower than that.
Even 10% maybe, 12%, something super low.
Well, it depends how you think about it, but normally people run these statistics over like a 20-year time period. So a divorce rate, even today, divorce is down, but at a peak when people would say half of all couples are getting divorced.
And it was, right?
It absolutely was, but really that's not how they measure it. They measure it over a 20-year period. So it's actually it's much less than half by those actual measures. But yeah, basically,
Because
nobody was getting
20
divorced.
Years. You can't just go to Vegas, get married, get divorced, and have that count as a divorce.
No, it does count as a divorce.
That does count.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's that people can't measure forever because you have to stop in time. So you sort of say how many marriages survive 20 years? It's like the classic Census Bureau statistic.
And is that 50%?
No. I used to write about this stuff for Time, but that got up to like 41% at one point.
Okay.
You know, meaning if someone lasted 25 years, then they got divorced. It wasn't being counted in that.
And did you have siblings when your parents split?
Yeah, I have an older and a younger brother.
Okay.
And growing up, nobody was getting divorced. No one talked about divorce. It was happening to some portion of society, but it was very rare. And then all of a sudden, someone my mom knew got divorced, and then my parents got divorced.
Basically,
but the biggest thing was that no one knew back then how to do that. So they lost all their friends because it was frowned upon. They were frowned upon by their families. My parents continued to fight. The cost of divorce and maintaining two households, all of a sudden, neither household could really pay the bills. With 3 boys, we fought all the time. I mean, we were close, but also fought all the time. And
just the economic splits, the economics of the split is insane. If it's under one house, it's so much easier.
Yeah.
If it's in 2 houses, everybody lowers their socioeconomic status.
Right.
That is insane. Yeah.
Right. Well, anyway, that was my childhood, but I got away. I wanted to get away. I came down to Stanford. I came here.
How did that happen? Was it good grades in school?
It was my math thing.
It was math.
Yeah. And then I did, I remember taking this philosophy class. I got bad grades in every class that required me to write. I couldn't write a history paper. I couldn't write an English paper. But my senior year, I took a philosophy class. And somehow that enabled a spark of me to take my creativity. I would just do weird stuff. I wish I would, I had friends growing up that we would do computers because of the math stuff, but I would be not really my thing, and they would go on to run Microsoft and stuff like that. And I'd just be I want to make weird sculptures out of found objects. I did, my creativity was very unformed, and I didn't know anybody, or no one in my family had ever done anything creative. But my mom, growing up, her boyfriend for a long time was a penniless writer. Mm. So the idea of being my mom loved intellectuals, wasn't quite one herself, but it was absolutely there were lots of periods of time where she kicked him out one time because he couldn't afford a roll of toilet paper. And that's what writing was.
Yeah. So, it still is in some ways for a lot of people.
Yeah. It's true.
Yeah.
But at least you could say my stuff is up on the internet. Back then, all you could say is my stuff is on a piece of paper. I typed it out.
Yeah, and then you got it digitally, which is great. And then also there are now incredible companies like Patreon that enable artists to get paid by building up followings that can then support them for really good work, which is super helpful. Okay, so when you came down for math,
so my this philosophy class, I remember sending in for my application to Stanford a 50-page dialogue I had written for no reason. It was just something I did on a Saturday between Plato and Socrates. And I imagined how they would try to one-up each other.
Oh, that's funny.
And I sent that in, and along with my math scores to Stanford. And
Oh, that's great.
But my math stuff was the ceiling effects there. So but then I got to Stanford, and I did a math one semester, and I was I don't know what you'd do with math in the real world. I couldn't imagine. It didn't. No one ever bothered to tell me, and I didn't go around asking either. And my parents didn't try to tell me what to do. I ended up doing economics, and then my junior year, my girlfriend, who was a senior, was writing an honors. I was what are you doing all the time? She's I'm writing an honors thesis. I'm that sounds fun. Like, what do you do? Like, you have to come up with a theory and you write. It's like, yeah, that sounds good. So I wrote a thesis, and then the next fall I wrote another thesis, and then the winter I wrote another thesis, and the spring I wrote another thesis. And I was studying Japanese economics with this guy, Masa Aoki. He's passed away now. But he was one of the leading thinkers in understanding difference in economic systems around the world.
Can we learn a little about these theses as well as Masa's thinking about economics on the way?
Think about what we've learned about assembly lines where workers have ideas and the workers worked in teams and everybody's idea was valued. So if a worker said, if instead of making the cart this high, we made the cart this high, I could do things better. And so Japanese manufacturing, learning by doing was the concept at the time.
Brilliant. Learning by doing.
Learning by doing, and also sort of this
open to ideas.
And a little bit of cooperative team-based working, where we, as opposed to this total reductionist, so people moved around within a team into different chores and jobs and tasks, and they learned from, so the beginning of multidisciplinarism as a rejection of the sort of breaking down all work into a taxonomy. And super specialization. So that powered like 80s economic theory. And
it powers my existence.
So I was studying cross-cultural economics, and I was interested mostly in the way that, not that culture affected economics, the way that economics was destroying culture with sort of mass economics. And then I did this little specialization, which was, I called it learning by using. What would now today we would understand as customer feedback, right? And all that stuff. So the whole chain of stuff, that one-to-one marketing in the 90s, now custom development innovation today.
Learn by using instead of customer feedback.
It was learn by using rather than learn by doing, and I applied all of learning by doing thinking to learning by using, and developed an economic theory around it. And Stanford wanted me to come get a PhD program. And they just said out of the blue, like, hey, you could stay here for the next 7 years, you get a free ride or whatever. And I was like, I actually have this weird feeling that the reason I wrote 4 economic theses was not because I love economics, because I think I love to write.
Yes.
And like, who writes 4 honors theses? Like, because it's fun.
Yeah.
And so I moved to New York. And I lived on a friend's couch, and I wrote a novel.
Yeah.
And it was a novel, and it was a love story of some sort. And at the end of the summer, I borrowed a typewriter from another friend, and I typed up the novel that had been handwriting. And I got about 3/4 of the way through typing it when I realized, it sucks, it's terrible, I'm no writer. And I moved back to San Francisco, and I went downtown, and I got a job, and I hated it, and I quit it, and I ended up in finance. And I ended up as on the bond sales floor at First Boston in the peak of the 80s. And I wasn't there because I wanted that to be my career. I didn't even know what. I actually just had fun, went to work at 4:30 in the morning. And moved $1 billion of money a day.
$1 billion a day.
Yeah.
Holy cow.
And because of my math background, that kind of math, we were doing the first derivatives, but it's just really not that hard math. And even though the beginning of synthetic instruments. So I sold a lot of those first synthetic instruments. Now I want to be very clear, I was an assistant. So I made $18,000 a year. And I got like bonus checks from salespeople who wrote me checks for like 10 grand or 5 grand. Like,
damn.
So I made about 30 grand when the guys I was working for and doing all this work for were making millions. And even then they were like, again, the same thing. Well, we think you should come, same thing as Stanford. We think you're great at this. You're the best we've ever seen. Come stay. And I was like, again, I'd gone back to like sleeping 4 hours a night and writing a novel again.
Yeah.
And I said, no, it's come back to me. I have to figure this out.
Yeah.
And I enrolled at State in night school and for 7 years wrote at State and did other jobs, and kind of eventually, like, to try to control this, I got into small book publishing, and I became chairman of a book distributor, and I was associate publisher of a small press here, and helped build the small press community.
Yes.
And then one day my writing didn't suck. It takes a long time.
It takes a long fucking time.
It takes so much time. You have to invest so much time
into learning how to write.
Isn't it crazy? We've been writing our whole lives, and yet really communicating. Like, I mean, like, you have to write 4 hours a day for 7 years to get any good at it. Yep. I mean, not that it doesn't. How long does it take to be a great doctor? How long does it take to be a lawyer, a great video editor?
That's right.
I don't care. I mean, it takes the same amount of time.
You don't just walk up and start sinking threes. It takes a long time.
But we do grow up shooting threes, and we do grow up writing, and we don't grow up doing surgery. So, but it is a weird thing. It's very, very frustrating and punishing, that period of your life when you're like you don't, and then there's a good 4 years
There's something that's also frustrating about writing, like you said, 3/4 of a book, and then going like, I'm not going to publish this. Right. Because, and I've written so many drafts myself where I'm just like, I'm not going to publish this. And it's like the marshmallow experiment. It takes patience until you wait and wait and write and write and write until it looks good enough that you love the way that you're communicating. And actually, Jordan Peterson, he broke down the way that he writes in such a fascinating way, because I'm sure that you also write this way. I write this way. Once you finish writing even a sentence, you might write that sentence 2 or 3 or 4 times with different arrangements of it to see what is the master sentence.
Every sentence.
Every sentence is like that.
Every sentence of every page of every book. Like, people don't realize like how much, like, because once I could write on a computer, you could write the same sentence 50 times if you needed to. And you didn't have to have a record of it, or you could save some of them because they're better. People don't realize, like, that's literally what you're doing. You're like iterating, hyper design constantly, you know, and like every thought, like, and should I have a comma or not have a comma? Should I use this word, not use this word? Like, and just getting it. It's such a perfectionist art, and we don't characterize it as that, right? We kind of characterize it as romantic art. But in fact, like, the degree of perfectionism that you bring to like every little detail, and slowly you attune yourself to like to doing this and understanding that this is what you do. That takes about 2 or 3 years, and then your writing is just as good as the stuff you would read in the New Yorker. You'd feel like it's just as good. Like, why is no one? My stuff's just as good. Why is that stuff you'd read elsewhere? Like, it feels like your stuff is just as good, but most commonly, people don't really have a point of view yet. They don't really have a voice. It's polished.
That's right.
It's accomplished. And book editors, you know, inboxes are just packed with this stuff that's all kind of polished and good, but it doesn't really have like something distinct about it. And learning to push through periods of imitation to finding your original sort of voice. Obviously, that originality comes from, you know, stealing so much, but finding it, you know.
I have a very interesting question that I think you'd enjoy. Do you think, as a proportion of population, we have more books now than we did, you know, 1,000 or even longer ago, or even 100 years ago?
Wait,
as a proportion of population.
1,000 years ago, before the printing press was invented?
100 or even 1,000. I'm curious of both. So as a percentage of population, I mean, 1,000 years ago, we had what, like 100 million people on the planet? Something really low. Yeah. And so as a percentage of population, how many people were publishing books per day versus today, out of 7.5 billion people, how many people are publishing books per day? I'm saying this because
the number of books still continues to drastically increase.
And as a percentage of population, has that increased as a percentage of population? Because it feels like we live in so much book noise. Yeah. As we live in social media noise, we live in book noise, and that's why I'm constantly trying to parse that noise to find the best books to read.
Well,
and I don't want to contribute to the noise. I want to write the best book.
Right. Like when I started in publishing in 1989, there were 50,000 books coming out a year. By the time I left in 95, it was 80,000.
Whoa.
By the 90s, it was easily over 100,000. And now it's well over 300,000.
A year.
It was also interesting to go back and look at the 60s.
Globally?
This is just in the US.
That's in the US?
In the 60s, so much fewer books were published. I don't remember the number. I want to say it was like 15,000. So like the good books stood out and people read them. And books were like, back then, almost like movies were up to 10 years ago. Up to 10 years ago, people saw the movies. The movies that came out, people saw them. And if they hadn't seen them, they'd read enough. You could go to lunch with a group of people and you could all talk about movies because enough people around the table had seen the movie or read enough about the movie to have a conversation with a shared experience, right?
Yeah.
Today, it's hard to find people who've read the same book as you. It's hard. It's even now that's happening to movies, where just so many movies come and go, and people haven't seen them.
So there's an increase in amount of opportunity of knowledge that people can go and immerse themselves into. That's why nowadays when you're like, have you seen Game of Thrones? And they're like, no, I haven't. And then that's because they've been reading a book. Meanwhile, the other person's been playing soccer. Meanwhile, the other person's been learning how to tweak a robot. Yeah, so it's just like people are doing so many different things.
It's interesting that we don't have this, one of the things that's happening with the atomization and fracturization of our culture is that we don't have these unified things. I mean, everybody tuned into the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, right? It was that was great for to everybody cared and everybody watched something. It was like what the Super Bowl was when I was a kid.
But everyone thought they had a perspective when they were not a research scientist on the matter. Which I thought was, nobody knew both of those two people for 20 years to understand who they were and read all the evidence, but everyone thought they knew something.
No, but at least it was the shared experience.
It was
that's
shared
the point.
Experience, sure.
But my point is that it shouldn't take, I mean, it's too bad that's the example that came to my mind because it was such a...
It was, you're right.
But
the shared experience around it.
Yeah.
Twitter is basically the consciousness of the planet. It's kind of weird in a sense.
Maybe the id of the planet.
Or the id of the planet. Yeah. Can I take us to when you started sharing the literary? Yeah. Can I take us back there?
Yeah.
And so then, how did you transition to the SF Writers Grotto?
So I sold my first novel to Random House, and I just thought a small press was going to publish it because I was working in
teach us about the novel.
So my first book, it was called Bombardiers. It was written in the style of Catch-22. I arrived at the style of writing.
Teach us about Catch-22 style.
Yeah, just a second. So that's what I'm going to do.
Okay.
I spent 3 or 4 years in this phase where I'm like feeling my stuff was just as good, and I tapped into, I came from a school of writing, I could call it the era of minimalism, and I was trying to write like that when really I was like a polymath and I was a maximalist living in an era of minimalism. And I finally was realizing this. And it was a writer named William Kittredge who told me, you're talking about like writing a sentence, right? And how every writer pauses in every sentence, at the end of every sentence, at the end of every paragraph, trying to figure out what to do next. And what writers do in that moment, how they decide what to do next. Yeah. Now in acting, there was an idea that like you sort of think, what would the character in the scene do next? What's genuine to the character? So that was one guiding. Another school of thought was, where does the words, where do the writing want to go? And some really good literary writers of the 90s that's what the song and of where do the words want to take you? Mm-hmm. And William Kittredge told me to get angry. No one had ever told me that before, to look into things that made me angry.
Oh, yeah, the shadow self.
Not to necessarily write about them, but to channel that anger into what I was writing.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden my work had even though it was fiction, had this sort of nonfiction commentary, state of the world, and I began to rebel against every rule of minimalism.
Yeah.
And I finally decided to write a book where I would break every rule, every sentence, every time. So for example, in the 90s, every book would have, there'd be a passage and then there'd be a white space. It's to symbolize end of scene, passing of time. You wouldn't have to write the boring stuff about then he left the room and then he walked into a new room. It's just kind of like the way a film cuts, right? So it's white space. So I decided I was going to have no white space.
No white space.
So it was an era where nobody used adverbs. Adverbs were the worst. Like adjectives were bad, but adverbs were the worst. So I was going to pack my book full of this kinetic adverb play.
Whoa.
You show not tell, right? Show not tell, show not tell. So I was just going to tell. And you don't write about the world of business because that's that world, and we want to have our own literary world where we don't have to think about what business was doing to the world. And I was like, I'm going to write about, I was on Wall Street, I'm going to write about how business is destroying the world. And so I wrote it was not in any way like a romanically of my time as a bond salesman. It was really an absolute abstraction of that. But and I also brought comedy back. I was really pissed. Minimalism, nothing was ever funny. And one day I was down in Zihuatanejo, Mexico, and I was at this motel, and then the lobby, they had I had nothing to read. I had Catch-22, and I was reading this thing, like, this is so funny. And it was an absurdist take on war and being bomber pilots in World War II. And he made that funny and poignant and an incredible damnation of the entire thing at the same time.
Yeah. And that's how you get ideas to stick sometimes.
Satire is humor sent on a moral mission. And I was like, why doesn't anyone write satire? Yeah. So I wrote a very dark satirical novel about how Wall Street was destroying the world called Bombardiers, where I metaphorically symbolized the bond salesman as the person who is sending bombs into the financial system that will blow up years later.
Oh shit! Yeah, that reminds me a lot of the 2008 crisis.
Yeah. So this was, I was writing this in the early '90s, predicting coming financial disasters. Yes. And the synthetic instruments that they had me sell. Oh, be careful about the marshmallow experiment, just because that thing's whole bunk. I'll tell you about that later. But
I want to learn about you from that. Yeah. Okay, continue, Bombardiers.
The 5 kids had ADHD. We know that now. So in the marshmallow test, the original thing.
Okay, but isn't it very clear in your own life that there is a pretty good amount of delayed gratification that you can explore in order to maximize your outcomes?
Yeah, but the idea that you could measure that construct in kids when they were 5 is what was sort of
bunk.
Yeah,
it's bunk. Okay,
bunk,
yeah. But even today, it's like I can reach over and grab my device and go and surf the Instagram, or I can open my notebook and I can write some ideas down. There's these different ways of
all that absolutely true.
Yeah.
Okay. So what we mean by the marshmallow test is 100% valid, even if the original Walter Mischel test was not.
Bombardiers is good.
So Bombardiers, so show not tell. So the first line I was supposed to just, show not tell. Instead I just told. I was like, first line is, it was a filthy profession, but the money was addicting, and they were all going to hell. I was like, and then I just went from there.
Yeah,
and
that's good stuff.
I broke every rule.
You wrote the thesis in the first sentence.
Yeah, the first sentence. Yeah. It's just like, put it out there. Yeah. Just say what it is.
I love it.
And then move on, and
that captured their attention.
It did, and so Random House bought it, and then it would go on to be sold in 20 languages, but before it was coming out, my close friend Ethan Waters had also sold his book, which was a debunking of the recovered memory movement of the time. And the writer Ethan Kanan was working on his 3rd book, and we decided to form the Writers' Grotto together.
Sweet.
And that was started with the 3 of us, which within a month became the 6 of us: Josh Kornbluth, filmmaker David Monroe, and an English writer named Tessa Suter, who's now really great jazz singer out of New York. And we started the Grotto, and we dreamed of a day that it could be a bigger thing. And we're now going into our 23rd year. We have 125 writers at 2nd and Bryant.
Yep.
And 3 classes a night, and the writers can make money teaching, which is great for them.
Yeah.
And despite rent going up, I mean, back in the original Grotto, each of us was paying about $230 a month for our office. Today, the average writer's spending $230 a month for an office. Now, they might share that office, but we've managed all this time without any grants, just by using the space really, really creatively to create a community for the writers who want to be there.
Yeah.
And it's become enormously improved in its diversity. Not fully there yet, but it's incredible. And the writing life has changed. There was a good 10 years there where it was people who wrote full time and all working professional writers, but now only a small subsector can sort of write all the time. They also teach or consult or do other work to kind of make a living at it. So, and we're at a really good transition point in the Grotto now, where we have a new group of the writers and a process by which we're sort of moving to nonprofit status, and we just kind of ran it as a community. We were just like, for a long time, like roommates. First it was 6 roommates, then it was 9 roommates, then it was 23 roommates, then it was 35, then it was 50, then it was 70. At 100, we were like, because we better like it's hard to remember what the rules are or what the security code is. Like, yeah. But the Writers' Grotto has been a great thing. So many great writers have come out of there.
23 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's, I love that.
Yeah.
Love it when we can stand the test of time. It's anti-fragile, and hopefully it stays another 23 years like the
I hope
Effect.
so. Yeah. That's the plan, and that was, frankly, that's our 5th location. At every location, we were booted out. The rent was going to be tripled, and we would be booted out. And we would have to get bigger and be really creative to find a new space. And pack more writers in and find a way to do it. Yeah. We managed to make it so far, which is not easy with what's happened, obviously, to the rents around the city.
I'm really happy that I got to come to the Writers' Grotto, and I wasn't even meeting you. I was meeting David Ewing Duncan there, and he has a very cool office there. He's authored a lot of books as well. Yeah. And I like how you're talking about the diversity of people at the Writers' Grotto. That also helps. You guys can help each other become better writers. What is it about writing? You were talking about it earlier. It was so fascinating when you were just speaking about this, but we were talking about how when one writes a book, they go through this process of iteration, and you can't be addicted to these devices and write books. And they don't work at the same time. No. The best writing I've ever had in my life was at the 10-day meditation retreat. Yeah. By far the best writing I've ever had, and most creative thinking, because there's no technology and there's no speaking, so you're all inward. Yeah. And so. And then you started.
So I'll just tell you a couple things about me. Yeah. So just for what it's worth. So that first novel I wrote it in a closet. And that first closet was literally 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. And I had a little metal chair, and it was an old Mac 512 on a little stool in front of me with the keyboard like on my lap. And I would close the door, and it was black in there, and I'd played one song for 9 months. Yeah. That became this sort of block out noise.
Exactly.
And when we started the Grotto, my office had a little old tiny bathroom in there. And there was space, the toilet was behind me, I had a little chair, I made a makeshift plywood desk in this bathroom and a curtain at that time to make it dark. Yeah. And I wrote my second novel there. And then at every grotto, I have a writing closet.
Writing closet.
Yeah, so I have my office, but I write in a closet. And to block everything out. Everything.
Yeah.
Like, don't bring my phone in there.
Exactly.
And I have to go into my world of what I'm writing.
Yes.
And
I love it, Poe.
so, like, yeah, you can't write if you've got this thing, right?
No.
There's no such thing.
Yep.
Nope, not real writing. Like, you know? And so it is amazing that all these books are getting published, because I don't know how people are writing them, to be honest, or they're just writing without thinking.
One thing that I think has very interestingly helped, there is a lot of writing without thinking going on, that's why there's so much noise. I think there's also something fascinating about being able to take the sentence and then go and copy and paste it 5 times, and then, because that's faster than writing it out by hand. So then the digital has helped in a sense, but also digitally, when you're connected to the internet, then you go and you look up a word, and then the next thing you know, you're browsing the internet for stuff, and you're like distracted from your writing.
Yeah.
So that's why the pen and paper is still really handy. So there's all this nuance. I love how you talk about your closet desk.
Just this big, you know, just like we were in the old dog and cat hospital for 5 years or so. We're at kitty corner to the Twitter building on Fell Street there, and now it's a big condo tower or something. But and it was morphed onto a parking garage, and at the back of the roof of the parking garage was the office that Ethan and I had, and in the back of the office, literally, it was an old kennel. It was a dog kennel about this size, and I put up like a plastic door, and my desk is only like 12 inches wide, like just enough for my computer.
Exactly.
And my chair was surrounded by concrete, painted white, and I did realize that like writing all the time, all day long in the dark, isn't so good for your like
eyes,
hormonal balance, I think, or something, in your eyes. So I learned to sort of keep a little light on. But I was staring into a screen all day too, so I don't necessarily
stressing the eyes in that sense.
Yeah, but I so I've written all my books like that.
What's a catch-22?
So a catch-22 is essentially, so it's never stated what is a catch-22. It's in the book Catch-22. They just describe catch-22s. They're essentially infinite loops or circular systems, or impossible logics, or the snake that's eating its tail. It's a catch-22 is essentially an oxymoron, or on some level, or hypocrisy, but really it's more a circular loop of logic. And
like, I'm gonna fly to LA, and then when I get to LA, I'm gonna fly to SF, but then every time I land in SF, I have to fly to LA.
Yeah.
So it's like writing a line of code that just constantly loops.
Yeah, so an infinite loop in code is one where a variable is dependent upon another variable, which is dependent on another variable, which is dependent on the original variable.
Original variable, yeah.
And then you end up, the computer doesn't know where to go when it gets into an infinite loop. And
interesting. And why is that writing style really important?
Because somehow when you see it and feel the examples, they call attention to, you know, it's like the absurdity of thinking we have it all thought out, and it destroys it calls attention to the fact that we have some things figured out but not others, and we do a lot of things because they were automatic to us. We were told to do them that way, and we don't realize how insane, sort of insane they are sometimes. And yeah, I think that that kind of style of writing and that mechanism is a little bit like, I haven't seen many examples of it in the last 10 years or so. It's interesting to think about it, actually. It was prevalent in a lot of my work until I started writing about social science, in which case I actually tried to use science and point things out rather than suggest that science was absurd for even attempting to explain human behavior, which at some point I felt like even when I wrote this book, Nurture Shock, which introduced the world to the concept of growth mindset.
That was the first time?
Well, Carol Dweck had been published her work in 1998. She had been doing those experiments since 1984. She had tried to get some press. It had no traction. When I discovered her book had sold 500 copies. And all I did was, I did a lot more, but basically in 2007, I took what she had done and I wrote it differently than she had written it. Same stuff. I was true to the science, but I explained it a little differently. And all of a sudden it exploded. Was
it with a little bit of that Bombardier's edge?
No, I'd taken that edge off. So that edge, that's really interesting, a good question. So I really had an edge until 2000. And then in 2000, I went down to Hollywood to write. And I was there for a little while, like 9 months or 10 months or so. And then I decided I needed to find a way to reach the other parts of my personality that weren't coming across. So my stuff had been a bit cynical or satirical and pointed, but I'm also a very compassionate person.
Yes.
I care about people. And that wasn't coming across in my writing.
Oh.
And I decided to write this book, What Should I Do With My Life, which became a #1 New York Times bestseller and all that. And I traveled the country telling people's life stories about how they'd changed their life. And I was doing it as sort of a rebellion against maybe the whole self-help thing or whatever, but it was like I wanted to really describe people's psychological journeys. And it was a very empathic, compassionate book. It was not satirical or cynical in the least. It was very different. For a lot of my readers, it was like, what are you doing? Like, this isn't, you're not being funny. Well, what are you doing? Like,
this is the polymath at work, though. This is really.
But then I had like a couple million new readers, so.
Exactly.
And I went on to do that with another social documentary about people's lives, family stories. And then to them, I did that again. Then I started writing about social science, and all of them were left behind. And again, it was sort of like, but what was happening in the mid-aughts was there was a lot of popular writing done. Sort of, it was this like you would like survey the science to try to explain a phenomenon, and in the end, you could sort of wink and laugh about how science will never really figure this stuff out. It's fun that they're sort of trying, And I was like, no, I don't like you guys characterizing science this way. Like, you're just not listening to this real scientists. Like, some scientists can't figure things out. Some scientists are just like economists. But some people have figured out real things. And I wanted to started to do that. And so that was a whole nother voice. So when I was writing about Carol Dweck for the first time, it was my first social science article. And it went on to get the top award from the American Association of Advancement of Science. And
what was the thesis of it?
Well, that article ended the self-esteem movement and ended the era of kids being told how great they were and how smart they were. And that article, around the world, except in France, where they weren't doing this, began the understanding of highlighting the importance as kids are forming their view of themselves and the world of effort and hard work.
Yeah.
So that whole body of work all came from was released through that article, reinterpreting Carol Dweck's work literally from 1984 through 98. And her book went on to sell 1 million copies too, and everybody, all the other scholars and writers who covered this space sort of unlocked from that.
Yeah.
But all I did was sort of rewrite the science a little bit. Simpler, cleaner,
Yes.
made it make sense.
Yes.
And took away jargon and just, and literally.
And it gave actionable, relatable examples of the whole everyone gets a trophy thing. Your kids gotta fucking work hard.
Right.
They have to learn how to become a master at something in life. They're not gonna become a master if they're just not investing. They're not investing time into learning skills and habits and things like that. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So the nurture shock crushed it. Okay. I'm taking notes because I'm loving what I'm learning, so I want to have things.
So also, I'll just tell you this thing, which is that my first 2 books were novels, right?
You can tell it's like video is not enough for me. I have to have
No, take notes to it. It's good.
I have to have this, and then on top of that, then you could rewatch this, but then that takes time. It's very interesting. I'm an obsessive compulsive note taker, obsessive compulsive interviewer. There's these just very strange idiosyncrasies about me that I don't think will ever go away.
It's good. I actually really like it because obviously when I interview people, I'm usually taking notes, and I'm not doing it on camera or something. But even it's interesting because normally, normally people don't take notes when they're interviewing me. They interview me on camera, right? But clearly you're thinking. I like it because it's like you're thinking. And it's very different than being interviewed by someone who's just trying to think of the next question when this guy stops talking, which is your typical, everything from your morning show to your radio show is different. I like it. Yeah. Keep taking notes is what I'm saying.
Thank you. And we're going to keep having this eccentric format of discourse.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is what the future of an interlocutor looks like.
Yeah.
When you participate in dialogue, it's not about waiting for them to finish to ask the next question. There is something about like some sort of what is a powerful question I can ask, but really a lot of it is about engaging, empathetic energetics, and then also, you were just talking, you said my first 2 novels were, and then you were going.
Yeah, so they were fiction, right? And then I started doing this work for magazines just to like pay the bills while I was thinking about my next book. And I'd always thought like I didn't want to do nonfiction. Like I had just too much of an imagination. I just needed to, do that forever. But the magazine assignments were taking me places and making me talk to people. And I actually found nonfiction to be total, to my surprise, but naive person that I was, as really interesting a creative challenge as anything, because you have this constraint, which is that you have to tell the truth.
Yes.
You have to be bounded by fact.
Yes.
But I was a writer, as a creative person, I wanted to write very creatively, but within the boundaries of fact.
That's so
and
interesting.
that was, it's like, a creative exercise where you say, well, you can't draw anything, you can only draw holding a pencil with your left hand. Well, now it's fun. Now you have some constraints, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, so within that box of constraints, I actually found really new sides to my creativity and my writing style. And also, then I made this vow. I actually said, I actually felt like, as a novel writer, that I had written a book that it wasn't like my time on Wall Street, but it was total absurdist, but it was clearly an extension of that. And then my second novel was set in Silicon Valley, and it was in the sort of tension between real hardcore engineers versus what was happening to the marketing of the Valley, and the tension between the creative engineers who were really doing something amazing, and then how their stuff was being marketed like as goofy and stupid. It had been, the whole thing was motivated by these interviews I had done, and when they first came up with parallel processing, Intel's original Pentium had parallel processing in it, but Microsoft software couldn't take advantage of it. So half the fucking chip was sitting there doing nothing, yet they were selling it during Super Bowls. And I was like, this is great. Like to spend time with these engineers, hardcore, you know, chipset designers who had made these breakthroughs, and then how bitter they felt that their amazing machine was being sold to the world as this great thing, right? But in fact, it was throttled by the software, and half of its potential was being wasted. And to me, that was a metaphor for a generation. Half of its potential was being wasted. How are we going to save the world if half of our potential is being wasted?
I love that phrase. Can we stay on that for a little bit? Because
that's been my whole thing all along, is human potential and what we're doing and how we get people to doing the right things. That's what Should I Do in Life? People don't see this through line, but my first two books were saying, my first book was about Wall Street, and it was like, basically, smart people, stop working there. You're not doing anything. You're only making it worse. Next book was about Silicon Valley, so like this great center of innovation of the world. Nevertheless, we're still wasting half of the processing power even here, right? And then What Should I Do in Life was about telling people to get on to a more meaningful life, find more meaningful things you can do with your work, you know, listen to that voice you have and follow it and be doing the right things in this world. Then the next couple books, like Nurture Shock, was where I began to think about the next generation, how we were going to ruin the next generation. And I needed to write this science book describing actual child development science, not what we thought it was or what society wanted to say because of our biases, and so that we could sort of help the next generation. And what I'm doing now, which we haven't even got to, but it's all about, like, you know, how do we guide people to having the right impact on the world? So that's really, even though my books look like all over the map of every form and every voice and every tone.
It's great.
But they're in fact united by this through line, which is, this is the thing I really care about, which is, what are people doing about what's happening to the world and how are we going to fix it?
And like Vivian Ming taught me it like 4 years ago, maximize human potential.
Yeah. And
I'm just stuck with that phrase forever. And when you say that half of the potential is being wasted, in my head, I'm thinking about that. I'm pretty sure I told you and Kayla this when we were hanging out a couple nights ago, but that if one's attention is positioned towards the devices, like this, if their attention is positioned this way towards the social apps, then their attention is not being positioned the other way, and the other way can be creative endeavoring, such as music, art, writing, sculpting, business execution, invention. You can go to nature bathe in oceans or in forests. You can go spend time with your friends and family, asking them deep questions, writing down all of the complex perspectives that exist on a specific issue so you can learn how to carry more perspectives and speak about that, which is a thesis of the book Stealing Fire by Stephen Kotler. I can go off, but the fact that it is connecting the world, fantastic. There's a lot of really good stuff to it. But we need to honestly talk about how it's majorly sacrificing human creativity for the instantaneous lottery system that we're doing, and also the meaning in life that is lost. So it's economic opportunity cost and it's meaning cost. It's costing us meaning in life. Yeah. So that's how I feel about this, and I'm so obsessed about it that it's one of the like 20 theses that I'm trying to crunch into a book and movie right now. And I'm being more patient with it. Poe, I used to be obsessively impatient with it, and I learned to become more patient with it. Because it's synthesizing information takes time.
It does take time. Yeah, I mean, like, my last book was published, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, and I actually decided, like, really writ large, like I was having a lot of visions around where we were headed as a society, and I felt like writing about the present wasn't going to help. And I also had a vision, a strong vision I still have around, like, that a writer, the sort of lone wolf writer, there's an observer effect, right? So we know this from mostly from quantum physics, that to measure or attempt to even look at all in any way alters the phenomenon. And in social science, it's called the Hawthorne Effect. People behave differently if they're being watched or monitored, right?
That's what it is. It's the Hawthorne Effect.
Yeah, and the media and writers have always played an observer effect role in society, right? Shining back a mirror that shows you something you've been neglecting or different.
Yes.
Ma had this big feeling that the observer effect was weakening. That the observer effect was weakening through pollution, not through anything, just as you say, like
through noise. Interesting.
Through noise. And people became inured to it. And also this thing, this thing just like, I remember this time, like I did this thing, it was a story for the New York Times Magazine, and I remember like when they would started to release stuff early for the magazine, so you could read like on a Tuesday what was going to be in the Sunday magazine online. And you had to go like find the link and stuff. And I did this, it was a story about how stress, short-term performance stress, like on high-stakes testing and SAT taking and kids and stuff, but it also relates to other stuff. But it's actually moderated by genotype. And that some kids, some people need stress to perform their best. It's based on how their brain works. And other people do not perform best under stress. They need a less stressful environment to perform their cognitive best. And any sort of testing of any sort is going to bias one population. Anyway, I wrote this story. And I remember like, by like Wednesday, before it was being published, it was the #1 most emailed article in the New York Times, right? And it stayed that way through Saturday. And on Sunday, it was published, and everybody could read it, and it was. But by Monday, it was gone.
Yeah.
And I had done stuff just a few years earlier, where stuff, like I did one for New York, where it was the #1 most emailed article for 5 years, right? Like all of a sudden, the news cycle of a big story was so short. And that was 5 years ago. Like today, you'd get an hour.
Yeah.
You know, and that, so not just the deep thought, but people who'd done deep thought and were communicating them, there was no way to stick.
Yeah.
And so I began to have this vision that like writers needed to work with maybe organizations or movements to align themselves in a way that it could stick.
Yes.
And that a writer just trying to do their own observer effect with an N of 1, that you would have be a blip.
Exactly, a blip.
And that's when I began looking for like around my thoughts around the future and where we're headed and how to announce stuff that's part of why I've been spending so much time at IndieBio, because that's like an organization where I felt like working with that team there and Arvin, like where our minds work really well together, but like that's a vision. It helps me feel like I'm not just being a writer, just doing this in the abstract entirely. Yeah. And don't know where that's headed, but it was literally like the result of this long-term vision of like what's a writer's role in our society and how do we actually change people's minds in a way that they don't just change back a minute later.
Yeah, like, so you're describing the issue that we have with this artist or this writer, or this information synthesizer, gorgeous synthesization of information that then comes up as a blip and is gone. Yeah. And I think one of the things that we're really aiming to do with simulation in the studio is our first goal up there on the left is polymathic educational platform database. Yeah. And we want these records of these conversations for anyone to be able to go back and watch Poe talk about how the fuck to write a book. Yeah. Or they can listen to someone talk about how to 3D print an organ. Right. And so when we create this massive database for young people to be able to access and get inspired by it, that will hopefully be a blip that can be accessed over time.
Right.
But it drives me nuts thinking that's the half-assed potential, the half of our potential being wasted.
Right.
Another example of that is what we were talking about with facing the attention economy,
right,
rather than going the other way and making something into the world. Your Hawthorne Effect was so interesting. I'm glad you brought that up, because there is, you know how many times I've thought about, this is what I had to silence myself when you were speaking, how many times I've thought about putting a camera in the studio that is constantly on and constantly streaming what I'm doing in the studio to the internet. Because if that was true, I promise you I would not masturbate. I promise you I would not eat refined sugar. I promise you I would work out more. I promise you these things are true. I promise you I would probably work more. I bet you all of those things are true. Because, and what do you think about that?
It sounds horrible. The camera, my man, and all that stuff. Like, oh my God, like, why can't we have fun? Like, or whatever, like, I mean, it just sounds like, I mean, like, but just, like, I don't know, like, when I go over to friends' houses, I'm like, tonight is off the record, right? And like, what are you talking about? I'm like, I mean, like literally off the record, like, no, you can't take a photo, you can't tweet anything tonight. Yeah. You can't, like, we're just gonna talk and have fun and do whatever, and it's off the record. Like, it's sort of, I'm not saying it's Vegas, you know, in the microcosm. I'm just saying, like, even don't repeat it. Like, just like, but let it live. Like, let's live and let's talk. Let's just have dinner or whatever.
But what about the asymmetry that Nassim Nicholas Taleb talks about, where your private life is different than your public life? And that asymmetry is actually unhealthy, because then you're a different person in those two scenarios.
Well, I would argue that same way that I needed to write books in a certain voice and then express a different part of my personality, this is how people actually become whole, is through that dualism. In an ideal world, sure, you could be yourself at all times. But who goes to work where they get to be themselves entirely, right?
I'm like, almost there, I would say.
Yeah, well,
I'm getting there.
It's great. Like, I think as people
some people
get more mature, they get more comfortable.
That's right.
And they don't feel like they have to do this self-presentation thing.
Yeah.
But I'm not talking about, like, people want to make fun of other people or be mean or swear or do drugs at work. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about, like, you know, being themselves. And to some extent, I think people, they balance their psyche out by it's a way to manifest their full self. So yeah, it's not. Is it unhealthy? Yeah, it hurts. Like, who hasn't, like, had a job and been there for a long time and felt like I'm a shadow of myself here? And that's why they have weekends, and that's why they have weeknights, and you find a way to live like that. Like, that's it's far from ideal. I certainly feel like people we're getting better and better with that. There's a lot less of that self-presentation requirements in workplaces and stuff, and much more acceptance. And,
yes.
But, yeah, there's still a lot of it.
Poe, what do we do about, you know, there's plenty more to discuss where you left off about nonfiction writing and creativity and fact being mushed together. I found that fascinating. It's a lot of what I'm writing about. I want to talk about that, but I also want to talk about how we move forward in the attention economy with the news cycle being the way it is, and with authors trying to have this profound synthesis that stays on the radar longer than a short blip, etc. What is our means to figure out how to move forward?
I don't know. I just try to, like, gravitate. Like, I recognize the problem and then I watch myself kind of migrate and move. I don't necessarily have, like, a thought of a plan of attack, but I do believe that every organization, every company is now a media company.
Yeah.
Everybody has to tell their story. You can't wait for the press to come to you. So if everything's a media company, including media companies, and media companies, like my publisher is just a big French conglomerate trying to make its margin and its return on invested capital, just like Goldman Sachs is. Like, there's no fucking difference at all. Like, and you know, if Fox and Disney own everything, like in media, like there's no fucking difference. It's just a corporation trying to get a return on invested capital by like sucking stuff out of writers. Like, it is what it is. So to me that's liberating on some level, and it'll freeze the writer from the construct that you have to do something, or that sort of like, right now there's like a pay scale, right? So like if you do your own podcast, you can have total creative freedom, but if you want to get paid, you got to find a way to, like, Sunday be Terry Gross or something, right? Like, or have, you know, shows with million audiences like every day, every week. Like, that's where the money is because of the volume. But those are just corporations, just like anything else. And so I feel like it's liberating to think you can go right with or for any organization, not just a media organization. It's like we've freed the writers from the, I mean, people are groping and groaning around like the lack of money for writers, and that the media pays, you know, 1/4 what it used to pay or whatever. But like, it's true. But on the other hand, we've been freed from this construct that we only write for sort of media entities, and that they somehow freed from the naive idea they somehow have, like they don't have to make money like anybody else does, which now they do, you know. And I feel like that opens the gates to saying, let's go write for anybody and everybody. Let's go find organizations who we like, and let's partner up, and let's work together. Let's co-create. Yeah. You know,
money entering media has made it also so that media needs to make clickbaity stuff, which makes it so that their fact is being distorted, disinformation is occurring. Money and disinformation go hand in hand in many ways, which is very unfortunate. Yeah. I want to ask you, and even though you live your life finding the solution, hopefully we can continue aiming to disseminate what is the optimal for children. I still think one of the major things is to spend less time on technology and more time creatively endeavoring, finding meaning from making. What do you think in terms of where you were at when you were talking about being creative in a nonfiction setting? So you had to have creativity and fact. You know, you were talking about that was fascinating. And then after that, you know, so these are basically like major exits on your career, where you went, took a pit stop, absorbed information, got back on the road, and continued driving. Yeah. So tell us more about the pit stops along the road, because these are really interesting.
Well, I've never known where I was going next. I've never knew what the next. Like I meet these writers who are like, I've got my next 6-book plan, and I'm like, wow, I'm so jealous. You know, like, but like, I never know, and no one in my life knows. And when I do, they're usually like, what do you mean you're gonna, like, what? Like, who would listen to you about that? Like, because I don't know anything when I start a project. I just sort of like gravitate to it, and I start learning stuff, and I start talking and researching, and maybe I write an article, and then all of a sudden like stuff starts to happen. But like, it's a weird thing. Like, the thing is, I guess on some level, I don't think of it this way, but there has to be some incredible trust in my own creativity to think I'm gonna figure it out, to sort of literally free myself. People who know me well say, like, I'm better at forgetting things than anyone they've ever met. Like, I'll I'll go back and look at my books, like, and you look at, like, how did I ever write this thing? Every word is well chosen. Every sentence is, look at how many sentences are in a book. Like, it's incredible. Like, how did I ever write that? Like, I can't imagine the amount of work that would take.
Yeah.
And even though I lived it, I look at it like, oh my God, like, how did I do that? Like, you know, deeply concentrate so hard for 3 years to absorb so much and get it right.
Yes.
And then after 2 years of promoting it or something and traveling the world and across languages and stuff, and then to walk away and just create this white space and say, I don't know what my next book's going to be. And as the books did well, I, you know, maybe had enough money that I didn't have to worry like where I was going to eat or how I was going to pay rent. I still had to worry about my future and doing other stuff. How would I ever buy a house, or how would I ever have kids?
Which might not even be necessary to do.
Today, yeah. But back when I was doing it, that was a fear. And it's not really a fear anymore. But just creating that sort of blank slate again. I think I was saying this to you a little bit the other day, but I remember when I started writing for Wired in the mid-90s, maybe it was 96 or 97, they sent me to do a profile of Danny Hillis, who had done Thinking Machines back in Boston, and he was just beginning to think about doing the long now and the clock that would last 10,000 years as to why. And I thought it was a great, weird idea, but I didn't know how to write the article, right? And but I went down to see Danny in LA, and the first thing he said to me, because I was probably like 31 years old at the time or something, right? And so I don't know how old Danny is, but he was older than me, right? He'd be maybe 15 years older. And he was like, you're pretty prolific. And he was basically gave me a warning that, like, your creativity and your prolificness, the enemy of that, the thing that will steal it as you get older, is not your age. Your mind is not any different. Your mind, if anything, just gets sharper and sharper and better. But it's distractions.
It's distractions.
And it's distractions which manifested in 1,000 emails a day.
Yep.
It manifested in people calling you. It's manifested in someone becoming sort of popular or well-known.
Yeah.
So suddenly everyone wants you to speak or do this or do that.
Here's a good, interesting example of what you're saying is when someone calls you, there's this fascinating calculation that you're doing in your head of where you rank on the hierarchy, where they rank on the competence hierarchy, whether or not they are going to be asking you for something, whether or not they're able to provide value or you're able to provide value, whether what you're doing in the moment's actually more worthwhile, versus if your phone's on silent, it's in a different room or it's off, you didn't even know the call happened. But almost always it's true that they're calling you at a convenience, disconvenience for you, for convenience for them, and that's again a hidden asymmetry in daily life that occurs.
I maybe only have 7 people in my life I'll answer a phone for, because of that. Like, you have to find ways to create space for thinking. And you know.
That's so interesting. Danny taught you that. That's
great. Danny taught me this, and it was like, and I'd be like, I was sort of like, what are you talking about, man? You know, like, I didn't get it. And then it was like, as stuff continued to happen and suddenly the world wants you to travel and wants you to speak and I was like, Danny, you're right. Like, and I literally, it took me 2 years to write the article, like to figure out how to write it. But in that pink time, stuff was happening, and I would be like, Danny, you're so right. The first day I met you, you said this to me, and at the time I didn't quite get it, but already over this 2 years I do. And I mean, that's just one way to look at this problem that we're talking about, which is this incredible need that if you want to have real thought, you have to put the other stuff down and find defense mechanisms. And sometimes it means being a bad person in other people's eyes.
It's true.
You know, it means like
respectable as
as possible. That's against the rules that you don't answer the call when so-and-so calls. Like, you know, like, or don't look at emails. Like, people think I'm blowing them off. Like, I don't read anybody's emails anymore.
Yeah.
Like, it's just like, why? Like, it's just a distraction. Like, of course I want to talk to people. I love people. I love everybody. But like, you have to find a way.
Yeah.
And
to create space.
Especially for like writing a book, like basically takes about 12 hours a day. Like, the world doesn't let anybody have that kind of time.
And it's ridiculous that we're ending the conversation on time, because time is such a fascinating topic. It's something I'm absolutely obsessed about. Time can, in a very universal way, time is the most valuable commodity, or attention is being the most valuable commodity, but also in a multiversal way, time is happening all at once, and however we can try and wrap our monkey minds around these things is I think we'll talk about that next time we sit down. We'll talk about automation and civilization and psychology, all the things we were talking about 2 nights ago.
The hollowing out of the economy, the labor force,
yes,
how people are going to be living in the future. I want to talk about that stuff.
The 80% on the bottom of the socioeconomic strata, and how they're moving extremely slowly forward, and they don't own assets, and how the top 20% at least own some assets, and the top 1% of that, holy cow, they own almost all the assets. So there's some insane stuff that is going on, and with automation happening. I've been talking about species bifurcation for a while, so I'm excited to talk to you about all that, Poe, and continue learning about the rest of your journey at the same time. So thank you for the sit down.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, that was so fun.
It was really fun.
And we got plenty more to talk about soon. Thanks everyone for tuning in for this first interview with Poe. We'll be back. We'll be doing a multi-camera shoot on another show with Poe soon. Thanks for tuning in. Give us a comment below with your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. Also, go and create, go and do, go and manifest your destiny into the world. Go build the future. Much love, everyone. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon. Peace.